Hello, my name is Amanda Hope Haley, and I am the red-haired archaeologist. Thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time today getting to know me and previewing future episodes about ancient dirt and dusty finds and what they can teach us about the biblical world. Biblical archaeology is my passion, and as you listen to this podcast, I hope it will start to excite you too. Last week, we talked a bit about Solomon's great cities and their gates. The gates were places of defense, commerce, and government. A lot of life was lived inside those gates. They were integral parts of the city for all of those reasons. And this week, we're going to take a look at the structures that were attached to those gates, basically the city walls. The first time the Bible really talks about city walls is in Joshua. In Joshua chapter 2, the Israelites are about to attack the first Canaanite city so that they can start taking over land for themselves. That city is called Jericho, and it's a rather famous story. This is the story where all of the Israelites march around the city one time for 6 days, and then on the last day, they march around it 7 times. They have the Ark of the Covenant in front of them. They're following God around, and at the end of the 7 days, the walls of the city fall. A small but integral part of the story revolves around a woman named Rahab. She is a Canaanite. She lives in Jericho, but she makes a decision to help the Israelites instead. We're going to read a little bit of her story. So the story goes that Israel has sent some spies into Jericho to find out what the city is like so that they can plan their attack. And Rahab is a woman who lives along the wall, and she has decided that she's going to help those spies. So these men come into her house, and when she realizes that the officials from the city are coming looking for them, she has them go upstairs to the roof of her home, and she hides them there. She proceeds to lie to the officials who come into her home and say that she doesn't know where the spies are, when naturally she does. After the officials leave, the Israelites come back, and they have a discussion with Rahab. They agree that they will save her family when the Israelites attack the city, as long as she hangs a red cord in the window so that they can recognize her house. Any family members that she puts into the house with her when the siege happens, they will be saved too. That is the agreement they make. And then after that, Rahab lowers them out of a window so that they can get out of the city. The particular verse that is really helpful in understanding what on earth this wall structure looks like is Joshua 2, verse 15. Since the rear of her house was actually part of the great city wall, she helped the men escape by simply lowering a rope for them from her window. Before they climbed down, she advised them to go into the mountains. So verse 15 says that her house was on the city wall. And as a kid, I thought that meant that she actually lived on top of the city wall, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I suppose I pictured beds tipping over in the rain and balancing up there. And that, of course, is not the case. What it more likely means is that her house was along the wall. That probably would be a little bit better translation there. From this little snippet of scripture, what do we know about the wall and what do we know about her house? We know that her house had a roof. That is where the spies hid. And we know that her house had a window. And we know that her house was in some way on the wall. Her house was not on top of the wall. It wasn't built the way maybe a siege tower or something like that would be put on top of the wall. What it more likely means is that her house was built along the wall or built into the wall. Possibly the back wall of her home was the city wall itself. There are several reasons this could have been the case, and we'll get to that. It also tells us that she let them down through a window. Now, if this house is along the city wall and its back wall is the wall itself, it's pretty unlikely that there would be windows within the city wall. That wouldn't be very good for defending the structure. And what about the window itself? I know when I hear window, I think of a pane of glass, something clear that you look out of, but something that is relatively air and insect tight. Well, glass wasn't really developed until the Roman Empire, and so she definitely didn't have glass in that window, which means a window would have simply been a hole to the outside world. What I always pictured as a kid was something like a casement window. We have a few of those in our house now. And that's the kind of window that is hinged, let's say on the left side, and then it has a latch on the right side. And it can swing open and closed the way, a standard door does, like you're the front door of your house. That's what's called a casement window. So I think what I imagined as a kid was Rahab's house on top of a very, very tall wall, a window that faced out into the world unknown, her putting a rope, her opening up the glass of the casement window, cranking it open, throwing a rope out, and them lowering themselves down the way Rapunzel's prince might have done when she was in her tower. That's a pretty unlikely picture, and we know that thanks to archaeology. Aside from the setup of her residence, the book of Joshua also tells us that Rahab was a harlot. That is the word that is used there. That may or may not be correct. We'll get to that in a minute. But if she were, assuming that she were a harlot and that is a good English translation of the Hebrew there, it would kind of make sense that she lived where she lived. If her house were on the exterior, it would have been cheaper to build because the city wall would have already been there. And so it essentially would have saved her a quarter of the effort and the building materials in order to build her square house. For that reason, the outskirts of the city were where the poorer people of the town tended to live. This was helpful to them that part of their structures were already built, but it also meant if the city were ever sieged, that they were the first line of defense. They would be the first people attacked. They would be less safe than those administrators and people who lived closer into the center of the city. After the king of Jericho's messengers left her house, Rahab went up onto the roof where the spies had been hiding and had a conversation with them. She basically tried to strike a deal. And this is what she said. I know the Eternal has given your people this land. Your coming has paralyzed us all with fear. We have heard how the Eternal held back the Red Sea so you could escape from Egypt on dry land, and how you completely destroyed the Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, and their kingdoms on the far side of the Jordan. As soon as this news reached us, our hearts melted like wax, and none of us had an ounce of courage left. The Eternal One, your God, is truly God of the heavens above and the earth below. Because I know all these things, this is my request. Since I have treated you kindly and have protected you, please promise me by the Eternal that you will do the same for my family. Give me some sign of good faith that when you destroy this city, you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and their families from death. A few verses later, the spies go on to grant her request and repeat it back to her. We will keep the oath we have sworn to you, but only if you will follow these instructions. Gather all of your family here in this house and tie the scarlet cord in the window where you let us down. If anyone goes out of the house and into the streets, then we can't be responsible for what happens to them. They will be killed and their blood will be on their hands, not on ours. We will be responsible if anything should happen to anyone you gather here. But remember, all of this depends on your keeping your word. If you tell anyone of our business, you will free us from our oath. Rahab then agreed. Based on the way it's worded, it's difficult to know if Rahab's family actually lived in the house with her. I've always assumed that they didn't. When the spies repeat it back to her, they tell her anyone that she gathers in the house will be protected. To me, that implies that they're extending this to people outside of her immediate family. We know that she was likely poor because she lived on the outskirts of the city. We don't know exactly who she lived with, if it was a large family. She may have lived with her father, she may not have. As we like to do when we're trying to understand the Bible better, we go to the archaeological sites where these events have occurred. The city of Jericho has been excavated. It's been well excavated. Actually, a couple hundred years were spent there doing the work. The problem with the Jericho site is that the timeline doesn't match up with the timeline in the Bible. According to Kathleen Kenyon and most other scholars who have worked there, the walls of Jericho fell during what is called the Middle Bronze period, and what we are talking about in the book of Joshua is the Late Bronze period. So the ground tells us that the walls of Jericho fell several hundred years prior to the events of this story. The wall at Jericho was impressive. As far as has been discovered today, it is the oldest security wall in the world. Other walls had been built out of different kinds of materials for different purposes, such as keeping floods out. But this one shows that it was actually built to protect the citizens of the city. There's also evidence that it was pretty good at keeping a flood out too, so that was just a perk. This wall is very old. It was built well before even the Middle Bronze period. It was built before pottery was even invented. It is a stone wall. It's about 6 feet thick. So my husband's 6'1". So if he, lays down on the floor and I look at him, that's how thick the walls were. I guess a house could have been on top of one of those walls. The walls were also, they averaged about 15 feet high. And within the stone walls was a single tower, and it was 28 feet tall. So if you can imagine, in certain places, that tower was actually twice the height of the wall itself. Around this thick, solid wall was what is called a dry moat. So if you picture, say, medieval castles and their moats with water and drawbridges that go over them, that's essentially the kind of thing we're talking about here, only water would not have been put inside of it. This dry moat was 27 feet wide and 9 feet deep at the deepest point, and it had been carved out of solid rock. Most of the places where dry moats are used, dry moats would have been carved out of the dust. It may have been hard work, hard dust, very compacted and rocky, but this was actually carved out of solid rock. The tools that they had at the time were really inadequate for the job. So it's one of those great mysteries as to how the people of Jericho built this dry moat back in the day. The first time I learned about a dry moat, I didn't really understand the purpose of it. In my mind, moats are there to have water in them to keep people out so that basically they drown before they get up to the city. Or they're so deep that it prevents people from marching down into them or anything. In my mind, the water is integral to the function of the moat. But a dry moat had its own specific set of purposes. Because it was so deep and because it was so wide, it did a good job of keeping forces back away from the city so that the people who were up in that wall tower or maybe who were scouting just from the tops of the tower could see the armies organizing way out in the distance in front of them. They knew what was coming before it got there. Dry moats were also good for keeping tabs on how the attacking army might be trying to get into your city. But this may not have worked quite so well in Jericho since it was solid stone. There's evidence in other cities where dry moats are in earth that the invading armies would bore into the sides and try to dig tunnels underneath the city and enter into the center of the city that way, thereby avoiding all of the defensive forces inside. What would happen is the city would send scouts out, sort of the reverse of what happens in the Rahab story. The city would send scouts out at night to look, and it would be very obvious from a distance if the attacking army was trying to bore into the city because the holes would be there. If something like that was found, then they had methods of literally smoking them out. They would put smoke or water or various things into those tunnels to protect the city. So the site that has been pretty positively identified as Jericho, sadly, it doesn't fit exactly with the calendar that's in the Bible, but it is still a great site to go and visit, and I look forward to being there this summer. Today, it, of course, is in Israel, but it is part of the West Bank. It is not very far from the Dead Sea, from Jerusalem. It's sort of in that area. As far as where Rahab's house may have been physically located in relation to the wall, there is no archaeological evidence that houses were ever built on top of the walls at Jericho that have been excavated. But it is possible, as we said, that they were built alongside the wall on the inside. Later on in Israel's history, around the time of David and Solomon, city walls became more complex, better defenders of the cities themselves. And one of the styles of wall was what's called a casemate wall. It was essentially two city walls that ran parallel to each other all the way around. And then it would have supports in between the two walls, forming essentially cells in between those two walls. Sometimes they would be filled with debris to make the walls much stronger against, say, battering rams and siege engines. Sometimes those cells would be used for storage, and sometimes those cells would become homes. Those casemate walls didn't exist during the time of the story of Jericho that's in the Bible, or during the Middle Bronze Age, when the physical site of Jericho appears to have been knocked down. But if Rahab's house was built alongside that wall, adjoining it, it would have been a lot like what would eventually become a casemate wall. Archaeologists call this a proto-casemate wall, and there's actually evidence of this in Israel. To me, it's a pretty good way of understanding what the Bible is describing. So we've talked about where Rahab lived and what she did, but until this point, I have avoided that one word, harlot. There's a good segment of academia that doesn't believe that Rahab was a harlot at all. They don't actually think that's what the original versions of the Bible said. This comes from the text itself. In the Hebrew language, all words are formed from 3 consonant roots. In the case of the word that gets translated into harlot or prostitute or something like that in your Bible, the English equivalents of the Hebrew consonants, which are translated, are Z, N, and H. Because Hebrew was written without vowels, the people who were reading the texts later relied on their own memories and traditions to just know what vowels went in there so that they understood what the words would be. The word ZNH that gets translated to prostitute, if you put different consonants in there, then that Hebrew word becomes something that means a female who gives food and provisions. In this case, Rahab is actually an innkeeper, if you want to think of her that way. She may have, though this text doesn't say it, she may have even been the daughter of an innkeeper. Often in the Bible, when women are described as evil figures, they get related to the sex trade. I think about Jezebel, who was considered to be a very wicked queen, and she was called a harlot regularly. Those women have negative things said about them throughout Scripture. What's interesting about Rahab, if she was indeed a harlot, is that the Bible never says anything negative about her. It doesn't really address her profession except simply to state it. Of course, we know that Rahab goes on to be a biblical heroine. In Joshua chapter 6, as the story ends, everything goes to plan. She and her family are saved. They live among the Israelites, and Rahab actually ends up being an ancestor of King David, and then later an ancestor of Jesus. During the various periods of Israel, Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, into the Iron Ages, each time period had a different type of city wall that was built. There were the casemate styles that we just talked about during the Iron Age. There's the proto-casemate style, which may be what we have being described here. But what we see on the ground were thick defensive walls were the most common early on. The archaeology of the city of Jericho tells us that it fell in the Middle Bronze Age. The Bible describes it falling during the Late Bronze Age. And the wall that is described is, if it is a proto-casemate wall, is more like what happened in the Iron Age. There may be a reason for these apparent discrepancies and a way to fit them all back together. During the 6th century BCE, that is right after the fall of Jerusalem to Babylonia, that is when scholars think that the absolute final version of the book of Joshua came to be. Joshua himself is credited as the author of it, and most likely he was the author of this oral tradition. He probably did not sit down and write out the words exactly as we have them today in the Hebrew or in the Greek. So during that Iron Age II period, right after the fall of Jerusalem, the Israelite settlements had casemate walls surrounding them. It is possible that when the final revision of Joshua was done during the 6th century BCE, after the fall of Jerusalem, that A well-meaning scribe, in reading the text, was picturing the walls that he knew in his day and not what the walls would have been like in the Middle or Late Bronze Age period. It's possible that he came through and changed the Hebrew to reflect that Rahab lived in the wall of Jericho, within a casemate wall or a proto-casemate wall, rather than on top of a thick defensive wall. So we don't really know if Rahab was a harlot or if she was an innkeeper. Either way, it seems that she had some experience moving people in and out of her home. When the spies leave her house, she gives them the instruction to go into the mountains. That way, she said, you won't be where the soldiers expect you to be. If you'll hide there for 3 days, the pursuers should have returned here by then, and you can go back safely. I'm not sure why she knew this. If she was just really had her thumb on the goings-on of the city. People who believe she was a harlot say that, maybe she got that information from some of the men who would hire her. There are all sorts of theories that swirl around about her. But the bottom line is, she knew what to do with the spies, how to hide them, and where to send them so that they wouldn't be caught in the end. Are you familiar with the word anachronism? It basically means out of time. So, for instance, David and I will sometimes be watching movies that are historical fiction, and maybe the costumes aren't quite right. Maybe the women have certain kinds of headdresses on that didn't exist at the time. What you're seeing there is called an anachronism. A casemate wall during the Middle Bronze Age would be an anachronism. A proto-casemate wall during the Middle Bronze Age would also be an anachronism, less so in the Late Bronze Age. Windows with glass panes most certainly would be an anachronism to the Bible. Another possible anachronism is the description of the scarlet cord that the men ask her to hang in her window. Jericho was known as a producer of flax. Flax was on top of Rahab's house, as the Bible tells us. Flax would also be broken down and used to make linen and threads for clothing. The cord that Rahab is told to hang in her window most likely is flax. The color is difficult to understand, though. It's rather obvious that the cord Rahab hung in her window would have been flax, but the meaning of the red color is harder to comprehend. It's possible that the color scarlet is a bit of an anachronism if it were added into the text later on. There were really 3 main dyes that were used in the ancient world. They were all variations on purple. There was a true purple, a color more toward blue, more of an indigo, and then a reddish purple. Of course, here we're probably talking about that reddish purple color. I've seen a lot of scholarship that goes to the Bible and goes to the book of Isaiah and points out that anytime he mentions the word scarlet, it is associated with sin. I'm not really a fan of that kind of theology because I believe it's anachronistic. At the time that Rahab was doing this, there's really no evidence to prove that the color of that cord was an indication of her business life. In this case, the archaeology that we get out of Jericho is a bit of a mixed bag. The original city did have a giant wall, the first defensive wall of its type. So it very obviously would have been a big target for the Israelites as they were attempting to conquer Canaan. The dating doesn't quite fit together, but that's one of those things I'm just going to have to log under I don't know and hope that we find more evidence in the ground later to help things make a little bit more sense. Or it may be one of those things that we just don't need to know the exact timing and dating of, and that's fine. Because the point of the story, there's a lot of points of the story. One of them, of course, is the way God helped his people found a nation of Israel, how they changed from being wanderers in the desert to being landowners and living inside cities. There's also the story about Rahab here. Here's a woman who, simply by virtue of being a woman, would have been a lesser member of society. She certainly was poor because she lived on the outskirts of the city, and she totally betrayed her Canaanite people. This woman, for no reason that's really specified beyond hearsay, this woman believed that the Israelites' God was the one true God. She and all the other people in the city had heard about their conquests of other wandering nations out in the desert, and they were afraid. She looked at that evidence and she saw God there. It was enough to change her mind. So Rahab, who was marginalized, whether or not she was a prostitute or an innkeeper, she was instrumental in Israel conquering their first city. So with Jericho, we find a little bit of a mixed bag when it comes to comparing the archaeology and the Bible. It absolutely makes sense that the Israelites would have targeted Jericho, a large, thriving city, a very well-defended city. It makes sense that they would have sent spies in. They spent a lot of time planning their attack. It totally fits. Sadly, the timeline of the ground doesn't exactly fit. Throughout the Old and New Testament, God has a habit of choosing the marginalized people for his will. And this instance with Rahab is certainly one of those. Our English translations say that she was a harlot. Some Hebrew scholars disagree and say that she was just an innkeeper. But regardless of who is correct, the Bible and the ground tells us that she was a marginalized member of society. She was a woman, so that puts her in that camp to begin with. But she also lived on the outskirts of the city, and that is where the poorer sections of society lived. So regardless of her profession or regardless of whatever her family did, she was a marginalized person. God ends up lifting her up, and she goes on to be the ancestor of King David and then later Jesus. If you enjoyed this episode of The Red-Haired Archaeologist, then I hope you will listen again soon. New episodes will be released each Friday. To learn more about me, check out my website, amandahopehaley.com. There you will find links to my books, this podcast, and my blog, where you can interact with me and other listeners.